Don't need any of
Thanks everybody for joining us. My name is Doug Mitchell. I have the great pleasure of being the executive director of the Glacier National Park Conservancy. I am joined by the best team in the business, Sean O'Leary, who's going to be handling Q&A today, Grace Kinsler, who is going to be taking attendance for purposes of giving away a couple of great books, one of which is a throwback, but really well connected to tonight's guest, and that is going to be our friend Jim Robbins's book, The Wonder of Birds. And the other book we're giving away is not next month, but the month after next feature, The Weight of Night by our dear friend Christine Carbo, the third in the series of 4, Glacier Park Mysteries. And then, of course, Stacy Dubuque is here, and Julie Doherty. So thanks to my incredible co-workers here at the Glacier Conservancy for all you do to make things like this possible. And thanks to all of you for making the projects in the park. We just met with the park and agreed to fundraise for, drum roll please, $3.4 million worth of projects for next year. We are going to together break a record, and we are going to be for the first time funding over $3 million in critical park projects throughout the park, and it wouldn't happen without all of you, so thank you. These events wouldn't happen without the generosity of authors. And tonight we are joined by an incredible writer and scientist and ethicist, David George Haskell, who joins us from Atlanta, Georgia. David, thanks so much for taking some time out to be with us.
Thank you, Doug. It's a great pleasure to be with you all. Send my greetings here from Atlanta.
So I mentioned earlier, you know, I have known for a long time that I'm not smart enough to write a book, but I did think before picking up this book that I was smart enough to read one. But this book really, to me, took me to another place. It challenged me as a reader and as a thinker. And I really think tonight is going to be very special, as David has put together a presentation for us so that he can help walk through kind of his thought process and the work that he does and how it is relevant to the building of community. I'm smarter for having read the book for sure. Low bar, you're right, but still, I'm there. And so, David, thanks again, and you know, I'll hand it off to you to kind of give us a primer on you, your work, and start the conversation.
Great, thank you, Doug, and such a pleasure to be with you all. And I salute the work that the Conservancy does. Really extraordinary work to honor the park, and the park for its own sake, for the sake of all the non-human beings, but also for all the park yields to humans in our need to connect with one another and to connect with living rivers and the sky and the trees and the non-human animals. So really extraordinarily important work in these very, very challenging times. So as you mentioned, I'm right now located in Atlanta, Georgia, and I want to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional custodians of the land here, the Muskogee Creek, and I want to pay my respects to the elders, both past, present, and emerging, and send my greetings out to you all wherever you're located. It's wonderful that we have a wide geographic spread of people here, and I'm imagining all the tree leaves and the tree roots in all the different parts of the country here. So we have some ecological diversity, even in the air that we're breathing, of course, because as I'm speaking, what am I doing? I'm exhaling air, and that air has come from the white oak tree. That's partly from the white oak tree that sits right outside the window, and the cherry laurels in the backyard. And so as I'm speaking, I'm imagining each of you in your particular place breathing the good air that the trees have provided for us. So I am going to speak for maybe 25 minutes, 30 minutes, and I want to leave plenty of time for questions, some conversations, some challenges and refutations if you have them, and give you a little bit of introduction to how I think about trees and tree relationships by using some specific examples from my book, The Songs of Trees. So I'm going to share some slides now just to kick things off. And so the central book here, The Songs of Trees, is the one we're going to be talking about this evening. But I think it's important to note that this book, in the context of the other work that I've done, so the first book that I wrote is called The Forest Unseen. For this book, I went to 1 square meter, one tiny little patch of old growth forest in Tennessee, again and again throughout the year, to shut up for a change and just try and pay attention to what was happening in that little patch of forest, to the smells, the sounds of birds, the influence that people were having there, the rhythms of the seasons and the stories of the creatures. And so what I was doing essentially was an ecological meditation. And then that meditation turned into a series of essays about the forest and what we might learn from paying attention to forests, because of course forests have been around on this planet for at least 400 million years. So surely attending to them have some lessons for us about the nature of life and how to make it in the long run. Forests really are the champion survivors. And that's an approach that I continued with the Songs of Trees, where if you read the book or glanced at its description, you'll know that I picked about a dozen trees in different parts of the world, really different parts of the world, and then returned to each individual tree again and again, dozens of times, to sit with the tree and to listen. Quite literally open my ears to what I was hearing in the tree. And the wind in its leaves reveals the architecture of the tree and the sounds of birds and human voices rising up through the tree and the vibrations that we can feel in the trunk. All of these are things that teach us about the nature of trees. And the big theme, I think, in this book is, and it's in the subtitle there, is about connection and interconnection. And I'll work through a few examples of that in the coming minutes. And then the book, another book that just came out a few weeks ago, Sounds Wild and Broken, is also about connection, but focusing in on acoustic connection. And so the trees, in a way, were the introduction to the world of soundscapes. And this third book looks at how sound connects creatures in the present moment, whether it's cicadas or frogs or birds, or human music and language. Where do our sounds fit in within the larger musics of the world? So the book discusses that, but also talks about sound in deep time. When did the earth first start to sing? How did the soundscapes that we hear and enjoy now evolve? How does human hearing, limited as it is, how did that appear, and how does that relate to how our ancestors heard one another? So today we're going to focus on the central book, The Songs of Trees, but I do want to make the case that there's a sort of a unity here about interconnection and paying attention, particularly with the senses. We live in this world sort of dominated by these devices, these phones and the laptop that I'm speaking into now, that are drawing our attention and our senses away from other beings. And I think we're in a time where we need to turn our attention back to the non-human world and listen a little bit. So, trees. Here is a slide. You may think this is from the wrong talk, but I think this is actually an important way to start thinking about trees. Here are some diagrams, some scans, 3D scans of the feet of 4 species of great ape: humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. You will notice some similarities. Our feet are quite similar to these other beings, our close cousins, except that they have a thumb on their back feet that can grasp. And so you can tell quite clearly that these are creatures whose hind feet are very well adapted, the chimpanzee, the gorilla, and the orangutan, for being in trees. Whereas ours, of course, are adapted to being bipedal. Every time I see a squirrel scamper up a tree or some other arboreal being, I'm filled with envy that we can't get up there. And it's been for about the last 2 million years that we've been fully bipedal creatures. But our ancestry as primates is mostly as arboreal beings. Primates have been around on this planet for about 50 million years ago. I mean, it depends exactly how you count. 65 million years, 50 million years. Almost all of that time, our ancestors were in the trees. Only recently, only in the last 3% of our time as primates, as the lineage leading to humans, have we been bipedal on the ground. So we have a sort of a distant ancestral memory of trees. And that manifests in unusual ways in the everyday. Here's one way. All of these, whether it's an orangutan, chimpanzee, or gorilla, they all make elevated nests up in the trees every night to go to sleep. Here's a chimpanzee doing that. And they refresh these and build new ones every single night. Unlike most other mammals, right? When a deer or a chipmunk goes to bed at night, it doesn't build an elevated platform to sleep on. It just beds down on the ground or down in its burrow. We do the same thing. This is my bed on the left. I wish that's actually either one of these beds looks rather attractive. But across all sorts of cultures, we make elevated platform beds to go to sleep. And in a way, it's a reenactment of our arboreal heritage. So when you go to bed tonight, remember that you're a primate climbing back into your tree. So the point I'm making here is that we have this sort of quite deep connection to trees. Here's another sort of unusual example of how we have this ancestral memory of being arboreal beings. This is Spivey Hall here in Atlanta, a place famed worldwide for its acoustics. And in fact, people fly in from all over the country to hear great musicians play, jazz and classical musicians in this space. This space is famous, as are other performance spaces, because it has just the right acoustic. What is that acoustic? Well, we have some early reflections of sound, so it sounds very fresh and alive, and just the right amount of reverberance from the walls, but not too much, so it doesn't sound too echoey. So the architects, of course, designed this very carefully. If you look at that reverberance and compare it to natural habitats out in the world, it's just like this. It's the reverberance of being in the woods. If you're out in an open field and you play the violin or sing, that sound just disappears. It doesn't reflect back to you at all, the way it does in a concert hall or in a forest. If you're in a cave, you get that reflection, but it's very echoey, a very, very long reverb. And that sounds great with flutes and a few other instruments. But for human speech, for most human music, it sounds terrible. So our aesthetic for listening to human music has within it an echo of the forest as well. And we remember these connections also in our religions, as here's Yggdrasil from the Norse religions, the sacred ash tree that connected the underworld, the 9 levels of the underworlds and the overworlds, the heavens and the earth. So a tree was the central connector in the Norse understanding of the world. The Buddha was enlightened underneath the Bodhi tree, and the tree emerges again and again in the Buddha's teaching. Within Christianity, of course, we have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but also in the book of Revelation, we have the Christ here standing by the tree of life with 12 crops of fruit, each yielding its fruit in every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. So also in the Abrahamic traditions, we remember trees in scripture and stories about forming the center of life and of interconnection. So my method for exploring these stories was not to go into religion so much as to go to the trees themselves and try to pay attention. And here's one of those trees, and I'm going to show you probably 2 or 3 examples here. And the first one is in the Amazon rainforest, and this is where the story of the book begins. So you have to imagine that humidity has gone up to nearly 100%, and the temperature is up in the high 80s or maybe up in the high 90s. Very humid. This is right on the equator. And this is a Sabo tree. The scientific name is Sabo pentandra. This is in eastern Ecuador, the very western part of the lowlands of the Amazon rainforest. Huge buttress roots. Those buttress roots are taller than a human. It takes 20 or more paces to walk around this tree. They're great giants. And to get up to the top of the tree, and this is the tree photographed here is in the Tiputini Biodiversity Preserve, you climb up this ladder that takes you up the equivalent of 10 stories in a human building. And of course, this ladder is made out of a kind of a grill-like metal. And so if you look down, you're looking straight down through the mid-stories and I have quite bad vertigo, so this was a challenge to get up there. But when you get up to the top of the tree and you look all around you, you realize that you are in a tree whose head is poking up above the rest of the forest. So unlike in the temperate world or the boreal forest, where the trees, at least the top of the tree canopy, tends to be fairly smooth, in the tropics, you got some trees that are much taller than others. And the Sabo tree sticks up way higher than all the others. And you can imagine the number of birds that love that. They use it as their perch to see what's going on in the rest of the forest. All around here, there are tens of thousands of square kilometers of tropical forest, a really extraordinary place. More species per hectare here, more species of tree and bird than in all of North America, the most biodiverse place we know of on the planet. And here are the leaves of the Sabo tree, but mostly when you're in the top of the tree, you don't see the leaves of the tree. In fact, you don't see the tree at all. You see bromeliads growing on the branches. You see fungi and lichens growing on it. You see one of 9 species of primate. This is a saki monkey up in the top of the tree. So there are 9 wild monkeys that live in these forests. Mosses, algae. The tree is extraordinarily rich place. Here are some more photographs of the branches. You can't even see the branches for the crowd of plants. There's a fig tree that grows on the top of the Sabo tree, a fig tree with a trunk much wider than a human torso. So this tree is an incredible hub of life in the forest. Now, this tree also faces massive challenges. Here is a leaf of, this is actually of an Inga tree in the Amazon rainforest. It's peppered with holes. This isn't someone, using a shotgun, target practice thing out in the woods. These are the holes, of course, left by herbivorous insects. There are 30,000 species of herbivorous insect in every hectare of forest here. And there are hundreds of thousands, probably millions of individual insects per hectare, all chewing down on the trees. So this is a place of great challenge for the trees. And in fact, some of these tree leaves, half of their weight is actually poisonous compounds to try and defend themselves. So how do the trees manage to survive in this very challenging environment? Well, one solution would be to separate and just go it alone and be a strong individual. But it turns out that is not an option in the rainforest. There is no creature in the rainforest that goes it alone. What the trees do is that they invite other creatures, other species into partnership. So every leaf has within it dozens or hundreds of other species of fungi and bacteria that live inside the leaf and help protect the leaf from herbivores, fight off pathogenic fungi, protect the tree in times of stress, like during the drought. So the function of the leaf emerges from a community of interactions between plant cells and fungal cells and bacterial cells inside the leaf. The same is true in the roots, because these tropical trees live in very nutrient-poor soils. Very hard to find essential nutrients like calcium and phosphorus and other things that the tree needs in order to build DNA and proteins and other things that all living beings need to survive. How does the tree find these nutrients? By symbiotic interactions with fungi. A tree root is interdigitated with cell to cell, all wrapped up, one being wrapped into another. The tree gives the fungi sugars, also gives the fungi information, and then the fungus responds with water and minerals. And so the function of a root, again, is not about individuality, but is in fact about a living community. And so every tree in the rainforest is comprised of dozens of species all working together. We Westerners give species individual names. So I introduced this tree by saying that this is a Sabo tree. Here we are back in the top of the Sabo tree. Well, that's in a way that name is a lie, because it's not just one species, it is dozens and dozens. So its name ought to manifest those dozens or hundreds of species, but of course, we're not going to do that. So we use this shorthand that also conforms to what we see. We see individual leaves, we don't see the microscopic interactions within each tree. So the tree is a living community. Interestingly, in these forests, the people who live and have lived in these forests for thousands of years, for example, the Warani, also understand that nobody can go it alone in the forest. There's an understanding within Warani society that anyone who chooses to try and go it alone in the forest is profoundly ill and destined for death. Because in order to survive and thrive, you need other beings. You need other people to help you. And in fact, for the Warani individual names are the product of the community. And if you leave one community and move house to another one, your old name disappears and you get a new name. They also don't give individual names to trees the way we do. Each tree has a name according to its context. So the context might be what sort of food is being used, or what particular spiritual significance, or is this tree growing in the upland or the lowland, in the wet soil or the dry soil. So names also come from community interactions within the rainforest. So trees in the rainforest are living communities. I'm going to skip over that. We can come to some of the threats that these trees face perhaps later on. But this story from the Amazon is also true of the trees around us here in North America. So every single spruce tree and pine tree growing in the Rocky Mountains, the mangroves down in Florida, the eastern deciduous forest, all of these trees are comprised of living communities. And the insides of leaves and the insides of roots are now sort of the frontier for biological exploration, because there's so much we don't know about how these interactions proceed. What we do know is if the interactions break apart, life for the tree often ends. Now, this is true also in other parts of the world more directly as it relates to people. So now we're going to Israel. This is the outside of the gates of the old city of Jerusalem in East Jerusalem here. This is the Damascus Gate. And growing in front of it is an olive tree. That olive tree, it lives in community and has lived in community with humans for thousands of years, and only thrives in the Mediterranean now because it lives in symbiosis with people. And the cultures of this region also are fundamentally reliant on, until very recently, reliant on the olive tree. So in the rainforest, the Sabo tree was working with dozens of species of fungi and bacteria, and a very complex living community. For the olive tree, it's more of a symbiosis between people and trees that has maintained both in this region. How does that work? Here's another photo of an olive looking across to the old city of Jerusalem. This is from the Mount of Olives. If you look at the bottom of an olive leaf, it's very silvery. That silveriness comes from this. This is an electron micrograph. So we're looking at a very, very zoomed in view under a microscope of the underside of an olive leaf. There are all these little umbrellas, microscopic umbrellas sheltering the underside of the leaf and creating underneath them a humid microclimate. And so the olive, even though it's in very arid air, is very well protected from drying out, from desiccation. So the olive is supremely well adapted to the Mediterranean climate, where it is often wet during the winter time, but then will dry out and be very hot in the summer. And so the olive has evolved there and has adapted to this environment. Its trunk, this is a tree that may be 1,000 years old here. It's all gnarly and lumpy because the trunk has expanded over the decades and over the centuries to take advantage of water first on one side of the trunk for a few decades and then on the other side. So the trunk and the root system is foraging out into the world to find water, to bring water up to the leaves and the fruits. And people about 8,000 years ago figured out that this tree could sustain life. There's more calories in 1 cup of olive oil than in almost any other crop that you can grow from, particularly in this very arid environment. And the olive tree just needs a little bit of tending, clear out some competing vegetation, maybe build some irrigation to help it out if you really want a fruitful olive grove. So the olive tree and humans entered into this symbiotic interaction. And for humans, the foundation of the civilizations around the Mediterranean was based on the olive. So it's also to an extent in the lowlands on wheat and some other crops, but up in the hills, the olive was the champion and made life possible in this region. And we can get a hint, a reminder of this by looking at the mud at the bottom of the Dead Sea. So a little geography reminder on the left of this graph is the Mediterranean. The prevailing winds come across Tel Aviv, come across Jerusalem, and blow all the pollen that the trees are releasing into the air in Jerusalem and dump it into the Dead Sea further out to the east. Some of it, of course, goes further out over into Jordan. The Dead Sea has been there for tens of thousands of years. So the mud at the bottom of the Dead Sea contains within it the remains of the pollen that blew centuries ago. And here is the Dead Sea, it's drying out, and you can see those layers of mud. If you take a deep layer of mud and put it under the microscope, you will see pollen grains from centuries ago that have been preserved in this mud, sometimes for millennia. Here's the one of interest to us. This is the pollen grain of an olive. And let me walk you briefly through this graph here. 10,000 years ago at the bottom of the graph, not much olive pollen. The olive is the olea, so the one here on the diagram, the column on the right-hand side. And the height of the dark line shows you how much olive pollen there was. After the olive was domesticated 8,000 years ago, still not much of it. And then through the Bronze Age, a lot of olives. And so the Bronze Age was built on the olive tree. And then at the end of the Bronze Age, you have a collapse where people could not tend their olive groves because of an extended drought. The trees disappeared from the landscape, and so did the people. Then when the rains returned and some measure of peace also returned, you have the Hellenistic period, the Romans, early Islamic, and so on, where olives really came back. And again, great civilizations were built on this. So wherever people and their trees were bonded together, civilizations thrive. Wherever that bond was broken, things fell apart and collapsed. And you go to the Mediterranean today, this is a photo in Israel, and the olive tree is still dominant across many of the hillsides because it still serves as a foundation of food supply in the region. The only things that over those 8,000 years that have broken that interconnection have been drought and war. And of course, we know that droughts are becoming more frequent in the Middle East and war is ongoing. And so we're in a time of peril because those life-giving links are threatened. Now, this story about people and trees being mutually dependent on one another for food is not just about the Middle East. It's also true in other parts of the world. Here are some hazelnuts. Turns out that the colonization of Western Europe, and particularly Northern Europe, Germany, the UK, Scandinavia, France, after the Ice Age, was made possible by hazelnuts. People weren't eating oats or wheat. They were feeding on hazelnuts and probably bringing those hazelnuts north with them. And the blue jays, these are photos of modern domesticated hazelnuts, I think from North America. But the hazelnut was the foundation of the colonization of Northern Europe. after the Ice Age. Here in North America, the same was true in the eastern deciduous forests with American chestnut, in the Southwest, pinyon pine, of course, very, very important. And so people and trees have been mutually interdependent on other continents as well. And this dependence continues at the heart of modern cities. One of the trees that I studied was this tree, a calorie pear in the middle of New York City. This is in Manhattan. This is as urban as you can get. And these trees are also life-giving. How so? Well, they're cooling the city down, saving tens of millions of dollars of air conditioning costs. They are also cleaning the air because every twig and leaf is a soot catcher. The particulate air pollution that is hazing the air in many cities, particularly from oil-fired apartment heating furnaces and also from diesel engines on buses and trucks, produces this. This is a swipe of a sponge across a windowsill just north of where that tree was growing. What is all that dark stuff on the sponge? Particulate pollution, in this case, particularly from buses, because this is a busy bus route, that settled on the windowsill and has now been cleaned up. That pollution is also in our lungs. Every breath of air you take in any way you're around internal combustion engines is bringing that stuff into your lungs. It goes from the lungs into the bloodstream and then inflames us from within. So air pollution isn't just a sort of an irritant to the lungs, it actually gets into our body. The trees are cleaning the air of this stuff. This is my hand after putting it on the tree after rain. You can see how much soot was on the tree. The tree is also a portal of green, carrying our imaginations out of the city into the wild green world. It gives us a smell, and the sight and even the sound of the wind and the leaves are necessary, I think, for the human imagination to transcend merely the human and to get out into the non-human. Trees on city streets also make possible interconnections between people, because where do people like to hang out? In the shade under the tree. If you watch where people like to take a picnic or stop and take a call on the phone or pull over to the side to tie their kid's shoelace, often it's around a tree. On a city sidewalk with no trees, most of those interactions are not possible. So trees, the trees also produces an amazing floral display in the spring, reminding us of the rhythms of the season, even in an asphalt-covered place like the middle of Manhattan. We give life, just as we gave life back to the olive trees, we give life back to trees in the city. Because it turns out if you plant a tree on the city street and put a little tag on it that says, "Hi, I'm your new tree. Please don't let your dog poop here. Don't chain your bike to this tree. Bring me some water if it's a dry day." That tree's probability of survival goes up to nearly 100% over 10 years. If you just plant the tree and leave it, just plant some anonymous municipal workers come and plant the tree and come back, 10 years later, that tree only has a 50-50 chance of being around. So by being given attention and personhood within human social networks, we actually give trees life as well. So no wonder then that trees are at the center of our understanding of meaning and of connection and of life-giving in our religious stories. Let me just stop sharing here as I conclude and open things up to question. Look at a dollar bill. On both sides of that dollar bill, you will see olives represented there, olive branches, leaves, and so on. Why is that? It's because in this country, we retain some of that memory of how important olives were back in the Mediterranean, inherited through the Greeks and then the Romans. Look into sacred scriptures. What is the name? Where does Christ come from? Christ means the anointed one, anointed with olive oil. In the Quran, God is compared to the light of an olive oil lamp. In Judaism, celebration of Hanukkah, the festival of lights, the olive oil that kept on burning even when it seemed like it wouldn't. Again and again, within our cultural symbols and religious scriptures, we remember that trees are those life-giving beings, and they give life through interconnection. And so the structure of my book has been to look at the form of that interconnection in radically different places: the Amazon rainforest, Jerusalem, Manhattan, up in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, a couple of trees in Colorado, both in the mountains and in the rivers, in the urban areas downstream from the Rockies. But in each of these really different places, the story in a way is the same, is that through interconnection, life emerges. And in this time of fragmentation and of fracture that we live in now, I will close with an invitation to you, and that is, wherever your home is, find a tree. And this summer, do a little experiment of just going in and checking in with that tree with your senses, listening, touching, smelling, feeling, and see where that sensory openness to the tree takes you in terms of interconnection and stories that emerge from that. The stories that you find will be really different from the ones that I found. But it takes an act of the will. We have to decide that we're going to do this, and then just devote a few minutes each week to checking in with our particular tree that we've chosen to be our guide and our teacher and our companion through the summer. So with that, thank you for your attention. I would be delighted to take any questions, comments, thoughts about what I've just said or about the book itself.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific idea. Thank you. What an incredible presentation, and it's so evocative of the stories you tell in the book, and you do so elegantly in your writing. I think it's a fabulous idea to adopt a tree. I'm going to do that. I challenge everybody here to do the same thing. And please, pop me an email of the picture of your tree in a story, and I'll populate those and send them to you, David, over time. I think that'd be great. And as usual, please use the chat feature to type in some questions, and Sean will curate those for us. Or you can always just obviously unmute yourself and barge ahead. That's great. I wanted to talk about, there's so many things in the book that are interesting to the current discussions about the park, about interconnectivity, symbiosis. But I want to start with the girl in the pink trousers. She comes back in the book occasionally. I think we meet her under a ponderosa pine, if my memory serves, in Colorado. Does she, for you, kind of serve as a kind of a ray of hope, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. So the story of the girl in the pink trousers was that I was hanging out with a ponderosa pine up at Florissant Fossil Beds National Monument, a wonderful place to visit if you're through Colorado anytime. And the thing about ponderosa trees is that they're very vocal. They make a lot of sound when the wind blows. But I'd sat there actually over several years, just going back again and again to sit with this tree. And she was the one person who really noticed the tree. She heard it, and the rest of her family as well were noticing all kinds of things about, they weren't just tied up in their own thoughts or checking their camera or on the phone or just talking to one another. They were open to the lives, the dynamic, the energy, the stories of the beings that they were with, including the more subtle ones like trees. Because of course, if you run into a bear or you see a bobcat out in the trail, it's exciting and it draws your attention. But to tune into the sound of trees, I think it takes a special kind of attention. So the fact that this child was being extremely attentive and taking great delight in listening to the trees gave me hope, because in those forms of connection, we gain renewal of ourselves and our spirits and the courage to go on and do good work in the world, to protect trees and to look out for one another. But also we ground ourselves in reality, that if we're not listening to the trees themselves and we're just reading reports or reading the news, and we're just listening to ourselves. And so I think part of our answer to the many crises that we're in right now has got to be, we need to listen beyond the human to the non-human world.
I wrote down something that you said early in the book. When you're talking about the Gunflint community, you said that the essence of the community is the network of interactions, not the collection of selves. And I think that speaks to what you were just saying about this need to, think differently as we think about being part of that whole. One of the things that challenged me to that is I feel like we're in the job of the world of conservation, right? And later in the book, you talk about, and I wrote that down, we too are nature, unsunderable, right? And so that challenged that idea of we're the protectors of nature, right? And that is a role. So kind of talk us through a little bit, kind of that idea that we can't believe that nature isn't, I think you called an other.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, as a biologist, to me, that's, say, the first diagram that I showed you of our foot compared to a chimpanzee's foot. It's like, yeah, there are cousins, and that just doesn't seem very controversial to me. But they're also, I mean, chimpanzees aren't, but trees and other beings are our neighbors, also our source of food. So biologically, we belong here. And so the question then is, what do we do with that understanding of belonging as ethical beings? And I think, of course, we're a very powerful species. There are billions of us on this planet with great appetites for stuff. And so, of course, we are called to be stewards and to take care of other non-human beings that don't have the same level of agency and control and power that we do. But I think that task is best thought of as a task of partnership and of kinship, rather than of domination and of control. Because the idea of separation and of domination is sort of what got us into this trouble in the first place. And of course, I'm not the many writers and thinkers and activists have argued this over the years. Rachel Carson, in particular, I think in the 1950s and beyond, in her books about nature, and then in Silent Spring later, made this case that we need to understand ourselves as biological beings that belong here, rather than thinking of nature as outside of us. And so I think, a city or say a factory is just as natural as a wilderness area. But that doesn't mean that the factory's effluent pipe is just as right. So I think we need to separate in our mind sort of being natural from being right. And the people who are marketing things at us often use natural as good. Well, there are plenty of things, of course, in nature that will kill you. If you eat the wrong plant, it will poison you. If you and there are things that happen between non-human animals that we would regard as deeply unethical if we did that to one another. And so nature is not a moral guide. We need to look for moral guidance into ourselves and into understanding how should we behave in relation to others. And again, that question is best asked not by thinking of us as separate, but by understanding that we're in deep relationship with others.
Yeah, super interesting. Sean, I know we've got some questions in the chat, so I'll hand it over to you for a moment. We're going to be doing our drawing and here soon. And Sean, over to you.
Okay. David, you have a couple compliments. Gail said it was an awesome presentation and thank you. And Mike said it was an incredibly elegantly well written and interesting book. The first question we have is from Mary Pat Serrano. How and when did you get interested in trees?
Well, as a kid, I was interested in trees because I like to climb them and just hang. I mean, I grew up in a fairly suburban area, and there's a tree in the back of the yard, and would climb up. It's just a small little thing, and so I did feel this kinship there. I would say that my interest in trees actually took two forms. One was very ecological. And so after I moved to North America, which is more than 30 years ago now, I started this practice of going out into the woods and just sitting and listening. First, because I wanted to learn the birds and the other more kind of obvious animals. and then came to understand that trees were really the creatures that were making everything happen in the forest. And so this sort of scientific and ecological fascination. The other is a kind of culinary route. So bay leaves and olive oil and chestnuts and things. I really enjoy eating all of those, and so have great gratitude to our cousins, the trees, for providing this food. And so there's a culinary delight in that. And I actually grew up in France, and so olive oil and bay leaves and so on are a very standard part of the diet there. But then came to realize, oh, these culinary stories have really deep roots and are really important to our story as humans. And of course, the Mediterranean, Western Europe is one form of that story. There are other stories of exactly the same kind in South America or in Africa. And so every culture has its own way of relating to trees. So yeah, there was an ecological component, but also a culinary fascination with trees that I think was part of my, and still is part of my fascination with these beings.
All right. And Lisa Hawk had made a comment about being overwhelmed both as a reader and as a concerned caring being on the planet. Overall, do you have hope for the trees of the planet?
Yes, I have lots of hope, because the trees, given half a chance, the trees can thrive and will thrive. Of course, trees face very severe threats, whether it's disease or over-harvesting or changes because of climate change and so on. I don't want to diminish for a moment the challenges that trees face, or the indirect effects of climate, like changing fire regimes. However, trees have been here for 400 million years. And trees, in their great abundance of reproduction, produce an awful lot of genetic diversity in all those seeds. And so if we can allow trees to mature and go through that process of reproduction, they are not consciously in the way that humans have consciousness, but they are problem solving. They are creative beings by producing this great genetic diversity of offspring that find their ways into new habitats. And so trees indeed can be, do have a future if we give them half a chance. Also, I would say, though, I'm more concerned, say, about human future without trees than trees without us. So if we disappeared from the planet, of course, trees would do just fine, most of them for a very long time. Without using trees to, say, for paper and wood, we have almost, I think, no hope of being sustainable on this planet, because trees are, in many contexts, the use of wood products is more sustainable than using plastic or steel or concrete. And so the challenge then is, how do we use wood sustainably? Right now in this country, we don't. We throw away hundreds of tons of furniture every year and recycle almost none of it. Could we reuse some of that? Could we treat furniture and wood products with more respect so they become a lot more sustainable? And so I do think part of the hope is actually, paradoxically, it also is in good forest management. Of course, there are ways of abusing forests with chainsaws and bad, unsustainable forest management, but I think also sustainable forest management is a huge part of what we need in terms of a sustainable future, as well as places set aside where we're not going to be cutting trees. All of those.
And that takes us back to kind of this whole idea of indigenous communities, right? Who had that idea of sustainable, even small intentional fires, right? To maintain the forest, not untrammeled by man as we think of it.
Yeah, well, yeah, certainly in this country, we have a definition of wilderness that is, that does not include humans. And I think there are the particular cultural reasons for that, and I'm fully supportive of protecting wilderness areas. But in a way, there's a philosophical absurdity in that what would be better is to live well within the world, not to have to set aside particular areas where we don't allow ourselves to really do anything. And I think that's a problematic view, because then it allows us to trash everything else. And so again, I'm very supportive of the Wilderness Act because we need it. What we ideally would need after the Wilderness Act is an ability to work symbiotically with the world everywhere, and treat everywhere with dignity and respect, and with the sacredness that is in all of life, rather than just in a few sacred groves.
All right, then we have a question on the olive tree slide that you have. Was the olive tree population directly from the sediment from the Black Sea that you mentioned?
So the photograph of the pollen grain, I don't remember the source of that. It could be from the Dead Sea. It may be a pollen grain from somewhere else. The pollen grains in the Dead Sea come directly from the mountains or the hills around Jerusalem. And so the Dead Sea provides this record. And the graph that I showed is from a mud core that was taken out of the mud at the bottom of the Dead Sea. And people have done similar studies in the Sea of Galilee and other water bodies in the Middle East, and found very similar stories. Yeah, so those pollen grains are preserved. And the same is true, say, in bogs in the United States. There are some swamps in the Southeast that have been here since before the last ice age. And if you drill down into those bogs, you can find preserved pollen grains that showed, say, that Tennessee was a spruce fir forest back a few thousand years ago at the height of the ice age.
So we have our winners of the books, and Julie Stevens. I have chosen to send you The Weight of Night, which is our next book, because I know that you participated in The Wonder of Birds already. So we're going to have that on its way to you. I'm also happy to say that David has been kind enough to agree to sign book plates for us. So if you would like a book plate, please just email Grace at glacier.org, or you can also use the chat, and Grace will take care of getting blank books plates to David. Thank you very much for doing that. It means a lot to
thank you all. Thank you,
us.
Grace, for handling all of this.
Doing all of the, and James in Boys Town, Nebraska, I'll be sending you The Wonder of Birds, great book by our friend, and very kind of similar idea, Jim Robbins of the New York Times. So
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
you got it. Our
Okay.
pleasure.
Okay.
And Sean, there were a couple of other, kind of interesting comments in the chat that maybe David wants to kind of comment on.
Yeah, let me start with Mark. He says, "Thank you, David. No book has impacted me more than The Songs of Trees since I first read Ishmael by Daniel Quinn in the early 2000s. In the preface, I was sold by 'We cannot step outside life's song. This music made us, it is our nature.' These sentences ring deep in my soul. Can't wait to read The Forest Unseen." And
Thank
then
you.
Kara McLaughlin said, "Listening to the trees, challenge accepted." Thank you, David.
Excellent.
And then Susan King had a comment. She said, "I think in the Judeo-Christian world, a lot of the challenges we have are related to the translation of dominion over versus protector of."
Yes, I do think, I mean, so the translation from the Hebrew is one challenge, of course, because when dominion is an English word and the Bible was not written in English. And I do think that the general structure of the Genesis and some other parts of the Old Testament is certainly is a hierarchical structure that places humans higher up the chain of being than some other beings. And then, I mean, I would add that in the last few hundred years, the emergence of globalized colonialism, which is has compounded some of these problems, because the way that we have treated the world as a resource to be exploited, which is not, that doesn't come from, at least not directly from any Hebrew Bible or anything, but it has certainly been a foundation of a lot of economic and military and colonial activity. I think is deeply embedded, and questioning those ways of thinking and of teaching and how our scientific worldview meshes fairly seamlessly with that approach, I think is one of the challenges of our time.
Yeah, and you speak to that, fairly directly, in the book as well. And I think it's really, interesting. We talked about this earlier. I'm just so taken by the fact that you can be a scientist and a biologist, and then also be able to turn on this switch to write so elegantly and think so deeply. I just generally don't put those two pieces together. How did you come to being able to do that?
Well, I don't know if I do that with any success, but thank you.
I think we'll all raise our hands and say you do it with elegant success.
Thank you. I mean, so my day job, if you like, is to be a professor at Sewanee, which is a liberal arts college in Tennessee. And so for 25 years, it has been my privilege to work with undergraduate students, most of whom are 18 to 21-year-olds, who have not yet been acculturated to the idea that we should be fragmented into say, here's a scientist, here's a philosopher, here's a musician. So I know we're just people. And of course, a lot of those undergrads are also pretty sleepy at 8 a.m. And so it's my job to try and reach them as whole beings. And so telling stories and putting things together, I think, is what teachers do, is what teachers struggle to do every day. I know I struggle mightily with that. And I think that helps me when it comes to trying to writing, is to how can I put some of these things together in a way that is interesting, that takes my knowledge and tries to put it together as an offering that may be interesting to other people. And so being a teacher for many years, I think is part of what, if anything helps, it's that. The other thing in terms of writing is just reading a lot. As a kid, I read a lot. I just loved reading novels and poetry and things like that. And I don't think one can be I don't like generalizations, but this is a fairly firm one. You can't really be an effective writer without taking on some of the musicality of the language by just reading a lot of other people. Just as if you want to be a great jazz clarinetist, you've got to listen to a lot of other jazz clarinetists. And this is what I try and encourage my students to do. If you want to be a good writer, read. I mean, of course, you got to write some stuff too, but mostly reading. So that's
a great lead in. So what's on your reading list right now, David?
Well, I just finished The Nutmeg's Curse by Amitav Ghosh, Ghoch. A very disturbing book, but a very powerful one about colonialism and trees and the agency of the non-human world. That's a really very wonderful book. Leander Lynn Haupt's book, Rooted. She's a writer in the Pacific Northwest. All sorts of amazing insights into what it means to open oneself to the non-living and the living world beyond the human. And a beautiful writer. So those are two books that I've really enjoyed lately. I've also been reading some N.K. Jemisin, sort of science fiction. She takes the science of geology and imagines a slightly different world where the geological forces and their interactions with people are different. Anyway, I don't write that kind of stuff, but reading it to me is really imagination expanding. And it's also a good break from the doom scrolling the news and things like that, reading about parallel universes. So it's good for the soul because it expands the imagination. And she is a really great storyteller. I just love reading his stories as well, whether or not they're edifying. They're just good yarns.
The scroll of doom. That's going to stick with me for a while. Well, you're super generous with your time. I have one more question before we go, though, which is, you share with us the experience you had being in community with this, whatever, 8 or 10 specific trees. If you were going back, what's the first one you'd go and visit and why?
Well, right now it would be the Sabo Tree in Ecuador, because with the lockdown and stuff, I really haven't been able to travel and so on. But, the other tree, and I didn't mention this today, and I did visit this tree just a couple of weeks ago, is a huge green ash tree that fell down in the forest in Tennessee. And I have been studying the afterlife of that tree now for many years. And by studying, I mean, I just show up and hang out with this dead log. And every time I go there, there's so much stuff going on. And so as the tree dies, it suffuses life back into the forest. And so that dead log, which sounds like the most boring thing in the world, right? I'm going to go hang out with a dead log in the woods, actually turns out to be a really extraordinary thing, because trees, for some trees, their afterlife is as long as their life. And by that, I mean their decomposition process can take decades. And certainly, up in Glacier National Park, other places in the Rockies, there are, the skeleton trees, the trees that are down, and because of the cold conditions at high elevation in the subalpine zone, extraordinary afterlife of trees there as well, and really important for the lives of many animals.
Well, you are super generous with your time, and I can't tell you how much it meant to all of us to both share time reading this extraordinary book, The Songs of Trees, and we're all, I know, looking forward to reading Sound, Wild and Unbroken as well. David George Haskell, thanks for being with us on the Glacier Book Club.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you all. I wish you a great summer.